Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michael Buckland. I am the CEO of the McKell Institute, and we are thrilled to be joined today by the Minister for Communications, Paul Fletcher, and arts and other things too, urban infrastructure. But today in particular, we're here to talk about communications and the new book that Paul has written about governing in the internet age. So thank you so much, Paul, for joining us.
Good to be with you, Michael.
Now, Paul hasn't been able to quite get away from the internet and digital communications since the 90s. He first worked as I think a senior advisor way back in the day in the communications minister's office. Worked as a senior executive at Optus and has I think was first the parliamentary secretary for communications way back in 2013. So you've been living this for a long time, and clearly one of the things I noticed was the thought you've put into the book, not just as responding to policy issues, but the principles behind them. From your point of view, why was that an important lesson to tell, or why was that an important issue to tackle?
I guess when the folks at Monash University Press asked me if I'd be interested in contributing to their series in the national interest, I thought, what is a subject I'd be interested in writing about, and taking a slightly longer perspective than we typically bring to bear in the day-to-day rush of being a minister and the responsibilities for government. And I thought that writing something about governing in the internet age would be a useful topic. And in part it's because what I realised somewhat frighteningly that I first came into this space 25 years ago when I started working for then Liberal Communications Minister Richard Alston. And the priorities at that time were things like Telstra privatisation, deregulation of telecommunications, or opening up telecommunications to competition. So the Howard government had just come in. It was continuing the work the Hawke and Keating governments had kicked off in terms of opening up telco to competition. And over that subsequent 25 years, I mean, the rate of change has just been extraordinary. And it's raised a new and continuing cascading set of issues. So I thought it was worth, I guess, reflecting on those issues, particularly the explosion of the internet, which was barely emerging from being a specialised resource used by, a few 100,000 researchers and scientists around the world, to becoming a mass market consumer phenomenon. That was just starting in the mid-90s. And of course, today, the figures from the ACCC's Digital Platforms Inquiry, over 17 million Australians use Facebook every month, over 19 million use Google, percentage of Australian households connected to the internet well into the 90s. So it's been an explosion, and it's also, and I guess is probably one of the central themes of the book, it's created a new area of work for government, but also new opportunities for government. And I've tried in the book to talk about some of the positives as well as some of the challenges.
Well, you do make that point clearly, and I do remember you even saying it in your press gallery speech not so long ago, that in all you think of this progress as a net social and economic positive, was I think the term you used. And but then you do go into a lot of the negative. Is that just because of your function as you need to look at the negative, or is it, or I guess, could you outline a little bit maybe about the nuance of how you see it? Is it increasingly a negative, or you just think these are issues that we need to mop up as they come along?
So my core argument, first of all, is that when the internet burst into popular understanding, and I argue that several things came together, including Tim Berners-Lee developing the World Wide Web, then the arrival of browsers like Netscape, which meant you no longer needed to use programming language to be able to use the internet. And then I argue that a major factor has been the explosion of the smartphone, both the mobile phone, but then the smartphone, which is increasing the way that many people access the internet. In the way of things, governments have a set of responsibilities, and keeping citizens safe is one of those central responsibilities. The internet poses some new challenges there. regulating content has always been a job for government. There've always been restrictions on what people are, what can be written about, what can be broadcast, whether that's for national security reasons, whether it's issues like defamation, protecting reputations, whether it's protecting children from age-inappropriate content. The internet has created big new challenges in how governments discharge all of those traditional responsibilities. At the same time, particularly for a country like Australia, a small, open economy in the economist jargon, a country with a major trading focus and export focus, the internet has created huge economic changes. I talk a fair bit in the book about what it means for all of us as consumers, that we now as ordinary people have the option, which many of us are enthusiastically taking up, to buy goods and services from around the world. I think the number was there were several 100,000 people who were consuming Netflix in Australia using a VPN before they formally launched in 2014 or 2015. Another stat, I remember being told in 2007, the iPhone launched, wasn't efficiently being sold in Australia until 2008. But I remember being told I'd just left Optus at that time, and the engineers there told me that they thought they had several, well, they could tell there were several 100,000 iPhones on the Optus network by the time the iPhone was officially being sold in Australia and available on the Telstra, Optus and Vodafone network. So the internet has meant we can all consume globally. That's created great new opportunities for consumers. It's also created new opportunities for Australian businesses like Atlassian and Canva and many others, Campaign Monitor. There's a whole range of businesses which have been able to build significant global sales in a way that just would have been impossible 30 years ago. But of course, it's also meant new challenges to existing businesses which until 20 years ago did not face global competition. The taxi industry, as we know, has been hugely disrupted by Uber, Airbnb, and the impact on traditional providers of accommodation. So all of these, in both economic areas and social areas, important new issues for government to grapple with. But at the same time, it is important to remember that in many ways, these are significant positives. In the way of things, there are some negatives as well, or some challenges that have to be dealt with.
Well, it's interesting. You said at the beginning, you talked a bit about the deregulation or opening up in telecommunications. It's interesting, though, the point in time where there's been so much talk, certainly in the last maybe decade, about deregulation and needing to open up and reduce red tape. And yet we're also talking about the need for regulation. Do you think that this is going to change opinions about the approach to regulation, of people being just more practical, that of course we need a degree of regulation in everything? Or do you think that's changing some of the political debate in that space?
I think one of the guiding principles is competitive neutrality. The ACCC produced the Digital Platforms Review. Then Treasurer Scott Morrison asked them to take on this work, looking particularly at the power of Facebook and Google. And what implications did that have from a competition policy perspective, as well as a consumer protection perspective, a privacy perspective, and so on. Now, one of the clear recommendations of the ACCC to government was that there ought to be, to the maximum extent possible, a harmonisation of regulation in the way that it applies to traditional businesses and to competitor internet-based businesses. One example amongst many is the competition between broadcast television on the one hand, as well as traditional subscription television, and then streaming video on demand on the other. SVOD services, Netflix, Disney+, Stan, now also Foxtel delivered services like Binge and Kayo, they've exploded, largely as a consequence of the fact that until 6 or 7 years ago, most of us did not have a sufficiently good broadband service at home to be able to watch streaming video. The NBN has changed that completely. So Netflix has gone from about 1 million subscribers, I think, in 2015 in Australia, to now 14 million. Extraordinary growth. I think over 70% of Australian households have an internet delivered content service that includes a streaming service or something like a Spotify, so music service as well. So one of the regulatory issues, or one of the policy issues, the economic policy issues that brings up is, for television, we've got a set of policy requirements in terms of Australian content for both cultural reasons and economic policy reasons in terms of supporting a domestic screen sector. Yet there's no formal content requirements on the SVODs. So that's one example where what we've done, what we're in the course of doing, is we have somewhat reduced the regulatory requirements on free-to-air television. So, for example, we've streamlined the points system for Australian content. They still have key Australian content requirements, I hasten to add, including 50% of all hours must be Australian content. And what we're now looking at is the question of whether there ought to be an Australian content requirement on the SVODs. Our first step there has been to impose a reporting requirement on them, and what that's told us is that around $150 million was spent by the four biggest services, Netflix, Disney+, Amazon Prime and Stan, in, I think that was calendar 2020, anyway, the first year for which there was reporting. So there is significant spend occurring, but long-winded way of saying, I think the issue is not so much do we reverse direction in terms of regulation. It's more about what is an appropriate, consistent level of regulation that starts from the proposition these businesses, although using different technologies, serve essentially the same market, and so you ought to try and harmonise the regulation between them as much as possible.
I think that's fair enough, and it's very interesting that some of the examples, if I can tease out sort of a theme I'm starting to pick up and see if it's something you've thought of as well, is we talk about some of these, I don't like the term traditional, but traditional companies, both in broadcasting and in perhaps taxi drivers. They are very heavily licensed, and that's almost how it's established originally, was a licensing scheme. Whereas a lot of the new digital companies have grown up in an environment that is almost a free market, more free market, so to speak. And so I guess we're seeing those two worlds collide, is what you're describing there. Is that an appropriate way to frame it?
I think that is a way to think about it. I suppose the way I put it in the book is that the internet exploded out of the lab, and it all happened so quickly that it took governments some time to catch up. I think the numbers I quote in the book are that there are about 2.5 million households connected to the internet in Australia by about 2000. It's now high 80s or even into the 90s in terms of percentage of households connected. So it grew very, very quickly. And it did take governments a little while to realise, and consumers moved ahead of governments. And one of the other complexities, of course, is that with these businesses being global, the extent to which any one country regulates them, it wasn't immediately obvious, for example, how you would apply, for example, regulation in Australia to a business based in the US or based in Sweden or based in China that's providing services online to Australians. Now, my argument is that governments, while they were caught on the back foot initially, increasingly have worked out how to regulate the internet. I'm not saying we've solved all the problems, far from it, but there was a strand of thinking, and there's a couple of quotes in the book, a sort of cyber libertarian view in the 90s that the internet should be beyond the realm of government. That was kind of mainly US thinking, I guess. But it was fairly influential for a while. And there was also a view that even if governments wanted to regulate, it was essentially going to be impossible. And I suppose one of my arguments in the book is, while it's not easy and not straightforward, governments have, over time, started to get on top of this issue. I mean, one example I cite is that for quite a long time, the position in relation to GST in Australia was that for purchases under $1,000, I think it was, if purchased online, GST would not apply. Well, that created a significant competitive disadvantage between global online retailers and bricks and mortar retailers in Australia. We changed the law. There was a protest from Amazon. They said, we're going to exit the market. They did exit for a while, but they came back. That's one example of many. And I do think the News Media Bargaining Code that we successfully legislated earlier this year is another example of governments, I guess, no longer starting with a self-defeating mindset that says it's impossible to regulate the internet giants.
No, it's interesting you point to that US thinking almost coming in the 90s, because I felt that we have a similar debate happening now, but in the context of sort of free speech, where there's a talk of, which is, again, you make the point that Australia has a long history of regulating content. But other countries maybe see that as particularly from the United States, where many of these the social platforms have come from, don't see it in the same way. And so they're almost getting caught in the middle, in that there are people arguing for any intervention is free speech, and then there's people arguing that, well, they have a responsibility. And so that does raise an do for them too, which is this is clearly a social problem where as a society we haven't worked out where the balance is. How do they balance that in your eyes, or how should they balance it in your eyes?
It is clearly a complexity that these giant global digital platforms are often operating and serving customers in 100 or more countries. And at the same time, each country, and certainly the government of Australia, absolutely must assert and must retain the right to exercise its jurisdiction. It's a question ultimately of sovereignty, as I argue in the book. There's an analogy, not a perfect analogy, but there's an analogy with how we deal with safety regulation for motor vehicles. Most motor vehicles are now manufactured by, global giants, a relatively small number of them, and we import vehicles each year. A typical year, over 1 million new vehicles sold in Australia. Now, there's a set of global safety standards. There's a UN body that administers them. We also have our own legislation, the Road Vehicle Standards Act. We absolutely insist on the right to set our own standards, but at the same time, in the main, what we do is we incorporate by reference those global standards, and there are significant consumer benefits to doing that, because if vehicles can be made to global standards rather than having to be tailored to individual markets, that means they're likely to be less expensive and more accessible to consumers. But we only do that if we're satisfied with the global standards. We also have the capacity to influence those global standards, and as it happens in vehicle safety standards, Australia has been quite influential. And we're also, quite influential, or at the forefront of thinking in terms of online safety. When we set up the e-Safety Commissioner, originally the Children's e-Safety Commissioner in 2015, that was world leading to have a specialist regulator for that. And we've continued to give the e-Safety Commissioner more powers over the years, and a major online Safety Act passed the Parliament about 3 months ago, bipartisan support, Liberal and Labor. Remarkably, the Greens chose not to support it, but supported by the two major parties. And that adds significant additional powers, including for the first time a scheme to deal with serious cyber abuse directed at Australian adults. There's a higher standard there than for our existing scheme for cyberbullying of children, because we need to balance freedom of speech issues, and adults are more resilient than children. But I guess my point is the the approach to global safety regulation, there are analogies with other industries that we can draw on. Underlying that, though, is a fundamental premise. We will require that services being delivered into the Australian market, in this case, social media, communication, interaction, safety must be part of that.
I think that's an excellent point, and one that segues very nicely into something that some people had submitted some questions ahead of time, but is also about how you talk about almost now as things start to interact with real life. So as services almost deliver a delivery form. And that brings you to talk of MyGov, and certainly in New South Wales here, there's been a lot of support, I think, for Service New South Wales, which has done a very good job of bringing, I guess, a more efficient tool. And so maybe to start with, I'll ask you about where you see the future development of that kind of delivery in a government sense.
I think it's enormously important. And I think fundamentally it's driven by citizens' expectations. In some ways, governments were slow off the mark compared to banks and insurance companies and airlines. We've all got used to being able to do things online with those kinds of service providers that 20 years ago would have been impossible. The idea that you can know your account balance instantly, you can transfer money very quickly with the click of a mouse, that kind of convenience just was impossible for consumers to have even 20 years ago. Governments for too long had still been saying to people, you've got to queue up and fill in a paper form and hand it across the counter, and you've got to take a number and you've got to wait. But the experience in countries like Estonia and Singapore in using technology to deliver services to citizens more quickly and efficiently is something that governments around the world have been looking at. And certainly at a state level, New South Wales, with Service New South Wales, very enthusiastic minister in Victor Dominello, who's got a real conviction about how to use the internet to serve citizens better, and things that would have seemed impossible even a few years ago, like having your driver's license on your smartphone, not having to turn up and queue to physically renew your registration. Similarly, Services Australia is taking that kind of approach. Stuart Robert, my ministerial counterpart, has a similar enthusiasm for using the internet to deliver services more efficiently to citizens. But again, in part, what governments are doing there rightly is responding to the expectations of citizens who are saying, well, look, I can get this with my bank. I can get this, when I book an airline ticket.
Yes.
Why is it so hard to deal with government?
Well, I agree. And I think that certainly we can applaud how Service New South Wales has done through the pandemic in particular, in responding very quickly. And I mean, there is while I'm loath to delve too much into what might be one of your colleagues' portfolio areas, but something that's relevant is that these changes, I look at how they're changing work too. So, I mean, you mentioned Amazon pulled out in Australia, and Amazon is looking to disrupt delivery processes through an increased use of almost gig workers in the delivery space. And so often it's these online and the gig economy that's working the same thing. It's something Mikkel's argued strongly is the need for that very regulation you've articulated here to be extended to that industry. Do you feel like there's a movement and that's a likely area for change? Do you feel like we're getting to that point, or do you think that it's still a long way off?
Clearly, what I think we want to do is ensure that we're all sharing in the economic benefits of this fundamental global transformation. One of my portfolio agencies is Australia Post. They're the market leader in parcel delivery. And of course, as people are doing huge amounts of buying goods and services online, or particularly goods, those need to be delivered. and Australia Post's parcel volumes have gone through the roof over the last couple of years. I think in August this year, when there was a lockdown in both New South Wales and Victoria, their parcel volumes were about 20% up on last Christmas, and Christmas is normally the peak. And some of that, we've seen big changes in consumer behaviour. I guess the point is, where are the opportunities for new jobs and new businesses? And what is interesting is the kinds of businesses that are now able to serve customers through e-commerce, and you can get started relatively quickly and easily by taking your parcels. You put up your website, you take your parcels, you get your orders, you take your parcels down to your local post office, and they're being delivered, and there's sort of fulfillment in the logistics jargon. So I guess my point is, while there's naturally focus on Amazon and some of the giants, the extent of growth in e-commerce is remarkable. The growth in categories is remarkable, and the opportunities for all kinds of businesses is very significant. And of course, Australia Post has a key role in that e-commerce transformation. One of the other agencies in my portfolio, which is key there, is NBN. We've now got almost 8.3 million premises connected to the NBN. So we've effectively got ubiquitous broadband, and that's key for both business and consumer. So certainly I think government has an important role in setting up or seeking to facilitate, I guess, all of us to be best placed to capture the opportunities that this economic transformation brings.
Fantastic. Now, I know that we're running out of time, and I don't want to keep you too late, but I've got to ask a couple of questions that have come through from people who are watching here. And the first goes back to your point about international standards, and asks, how are we doing in the coordination of those standards? I mean, we talk about it a lot, of international cooperation to deal with things like tax and so on. Are we making progress there? Is it working?
Look, I think we can see evidence that there is significant progress. The announcement from the OECD, just quite recently on this more uniform international approach on tax, is a key example of that. And that's something the Australian government's been pushing for quite significantly. And of course, it is a lot of the global digital giants that have highlighted some of the inconsistencies in tax arrangements. As we know, if you're somebody who advertises with Facebook or Google, and many Australian businesses, including small businesses, do, then your invoice is coming from Singapore or Ireland, because they're low tax places. And so that OECD approach is part of tackling that. Similarly, our government has used international forums in relation to our calls for appropriate regulatory frameworks in relation to the digital platforms and the internet globally, particularly, for example, after the appalling Christchurch mosque attack, which saw the murder of more than 50 people live streamed on Facebook. That ran for over 40 minutes, absolutely horrific. And so certainly we were very strong in global forums on that, as of course was New Zealand and other nations. And that has been, I think, important in influencing the overall framework within which the platforms operate. Again, emphasising there is definitely more work to do.
Yeah. Now, I do know, sorry, everyone, that I'll just do one more question. We can't take any more. We're getting a couple through direct channels too. But Mikkel recently published a report looking at access to digital infrastructure in Queensland. And we did see that some communities are really suffer a significant disadvantage in access. And so the question we've got that's come through but asks, the digitization of government services is great. Sure, it creates benefits, But how do we then deal with the inevitable, which is people who cannot afford to, or through some other issue of access those services?
It's an important question. When I think about the discussion of the issue that was coined the digital divide, probably in the mid-90s, and the way that's evolved, I think it's evolved in ways that many of us didn't foresee at the time. In the mid-90s, the way to get online was you needed a PC, you needed a dial-up internet connection, and that was a lot of money, and you had to keep paying that money every month. Now, very large numbers of people are getting online through a smartphone, and you can have a smartphone that's prepaid. So while, yes, I recognise, of course, there are equity issues, I suppose the point is that the way the technology's evolved, in terms of those who are able to have access, I think it's a much higher proportion than might have been expected in the mid-90s. The other point I'd make as a local member, and I think every MP would say the same thing, you do have to recognise that there are people who are not online or who don't want to be. Sometimes it's age-related. And as always, you have to respect the diversity of the Australian population. But at the same time, a very large percentage of people are, and it's an efficient way of serving people, both from the point of view of government and from the point of citizens. They find it efficient.
Well, your electorate of Bradfield, named after one of the great engineers and of Australian engineers, brings maybe is an interesting reminder of looking at a new form of infrastructure in the digital infrastructure that you're looking at now. And so we thank you so much for your time and appreciate you chatting through some of these issues. I think it's important for us to have a strong dialogue with government about where their thinking is in these important spaces as we go forward. And so thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate the opportunity.
Now, everyone, you can get a copy of Paul's book, Governing in the Internet Age. Here it is up there from Monash Publishing. The links will be put through in the chat, and you'll receive a link in an email following this. It's been a pleasure, and thank you all for joining us at home. Enjoy the rest of your day.